Many people believe that technological innovations are the solution to the climate crisis. While certainly important, we need to face the fact that cultural changes are every bit as much, if not often more important. To understand how, let's take cars as an example. A typical car in the U.S. emits about 4.6 metric tons of CO2 per year. Given that the average American's total annual emissions of CO2 are around 20 metric tons, cars account for about a quarter of our individual carbon footprints. Thus, if we want to reduce our individual climate footprints, cars are clearly one of the lowest hanging fruit. For decades now, electric automobiles have been touted as a solution to this enormous problem, as they do not directly emit CO2 while operating. Each one of these thus promises to reduce those 4.6 metric tons of CO2 down to zero per year. Hence, they're often called zero-emission vehicles. It's hardly surprising, then, that for decades electric cars have been held out as a sort of holy grail. Now that they are finally becoming practical and affordable, it would seem that in one motion our problem is solved. Sadly, it's not. If we are to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris Accord signed at COP21, each person on the planet can annually emit no more than about 2 metric tons of CO2 or equivalent gases. Think of this like a dietary guideline. The FDA tells you that if you want a healthy body, you should consume no more than 2,000 or 2,500 calories per day. Similarly, if you want a healthy planet, you should emit no more than 2 metric tons of CO2 or equivalent gases per year. With respect to the climate crisis, the problem with cars involves their production. First, the good news regarding electric cars. Even though manufacturing an electric car produces somewhere between 15 and 68% more greenhouse gases than similar gasoline cars, over their lifetime, electric cars generate half of the emissions of their gasoline counterparts, more than compensating for increased emissions during production. So, if you're going to buy a car, an electric one is arguably the better choice with respect to climate crisis, all things considered. But should you buy one at all? Or are there other external factors to a car's operation that we need to consider? The manufacturer of a typical automobile emits an extraordinary amount of CO2 or equivalent gases. Manufacturing a typical mid-range car, considering something like a Toyota Prius, which is a hybrid, releases about 17 metric tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. Top-of-the-line SUV, a Range Rover, emits about 35 metric tons. Let's lean towards the lower end and assume about 22 metric tons of CO2 or equivalent gases are manufactured or emitted during the manufacture of the average car on the road. Even though SUVs and crossover sales are currently dominating the American market and electric cars now coming online release more greenhouse gases than their manufacturer, let's go with the lower number. Also consider that the average car now has a lifespan of about 11 years. This is up from a couple of decades ago. So, if we spread out those 22 metric tons of CO2 emitted during a car's manufacture over its 11-year lifetime, we come up with about 2 metric tons per year. Recall that if you want a healthy planet, you should emit no more than 2 tons of CO2 per year. Thus, if you buy a succession of cars during your lifetime, one every 11 years, and leave them in your driveway, parked, and never drive them, you will have totally expended your CO2 allotment for your lifetime. And of course, this does not take into account the emissions allotted for anything else, such as food, clothing, housing, and everything else that you need, including actually driving that car. In case you're wondering, recycling can't help much here, as automobiles are already mostly recycled of all consumer products. We could also hope that few people on the planet will own cars. During the 20th century, most cars on the planet were owned by Americans and Europeans. The problem is that we have made them so popular and so appealing that the rest of the world now, not surprisingly, wants them. India is currently the 5th largest car market in the world and growing rapidly. China, now the largest market, quickly developing an altogether unprecedented love of cars. In 1985, there were 1.78 million total vehicles in China. In 2017, car ownership alone had soared to 172 million. That's an astonishing increase of 10,000% in just 3 decades. There are currently just over 1 billion cars on the planet. Because the rest of the world is now also quickly becoming infatuated with them, just like Americans, that number is expected to double to 2 billion in the next 15 or 20 years. The problem is that if we focus just on emissions and see this primarily as a technological challenge, we will lose the fight against climate change. For decades, we have held out hope that technology and industry will produce a car with zero emissions coming out of the tailpipe, when we instead should have been focusing on the car itself. Instead of trying to produce a truly emissions-free automobile, if we consider its entire life cycle, it's obviously impossible. Hence, we instead need to turn our attention to car use. The automobile is just one example of the hope that technology alone will get us out of this problem. There is no need to stop driving cars, so the hope goes, as someone will come along and give us a zero-emission-free automobile. Elon Musk, of course, likes to cast himself as this particular savior. But the fact is that no matter how hard we try, making a 5,000-pound vehicle to carry one person will never be environmentally sound for the planet. For decades now, we have pinned our hope on re-engineering the automobile. As far as I am concerned, that was a complete and utter waste of time. Unimaginably precious time during a crucial moment when the climate crisis was unfolding. Effort was not only wasted on this thoroughly misguided project, but attention was drawn away from the real job at hand. We should instead have been focusing our attention on re-engineering the cultural practice of car use. This is not to say that technology is not needed to help solve this problem along with cultural change. So, as it turns out, it is technologically possible to transport a person 350, 500, even an astonishing 750 miles on a single gallon of gasoline. In other words, it is theoretically possible to transport someone from LA to New York on just 4 gallons of gas. Not only is it possible, the good news is that these transportation technologies are no longer still in the experimental stage. To the contrary, they have all proven themselves and in fact have been in widespread use for over a century. So what are these wonder technologies? Buses, subways, and trains, respectively. When compared to a 25 mile per gallon car, which is currently the average efficiency of a new automobile in the U.S., with a single occupant, and unfortunately, 3 out of 4 cars on the road have just one person in them. In comparison to that, a bus is 14 times more efficient, hence 1 gallon of gasoline can transport a person by bus 350 miles. A subway is 20 times more so, that's 500 miles per gallon, and a passenger train 30 times more efficient, 750 miles per gallon. A few years ago, a perceptive student of mine, reflecting on the situation and these numbers, succinctly observed that, quote, what we need is not a 100-mile-per-gallon car, but rather for taking the bus to become cool and owning a car to be anything but. I could not agree more. Incidentally, even 750 miles per gallon can be improved upon, and it's embarrassingly easy to do so. In parts of Manhattan, for example, over a third of commuters walk to work. Bicycling is even more efficient. New Yorkers, incidentally, are 11 times more likely to take mass transit like subways and buses to work than the average American. As Edward Glaser, David Owen, and many others have thus argued, cities are far more efficient than suburbs and rural locales. This is clearly the case with fossil fuel use and corresponding carbon footprints. The example of New York and cities more generally make clear that it's quite possible for modern human beings to live rich and diverse lives largely free of the automobile. Why, then, do so many Americans drive cars? And why do we drive so many of them? The U.S. has fewer than 4% of the planet's population, yet a quarter of its cars. Placed end to end, they would circle the Earth 31 times. As my student realized, in the U.S., cars are cool, really cool. In fact, in the U.S., we have more cars than we have licensed drivers. Nonetheless, automobiles are an environmental disaster. If everything else were equal, switching from car to bus could reduce our individual carbon footprints for transportation by a factor of 14. Yet with fewer than 5% of Americans taking the bus to work, as opposed to 85% using cars to commute, buses are clearly not at all desirable. But why are cars so cool and buses not? This is not a question for the STEM fields, but rather for the social sciences and the environmental humanities, where we seek to understand just why people do what they do. Science may be able to tell us how human beings are changing our global climate, but not why we are doing it. The sciences may be able to offer us more advanced technology, i.e., more efficient cars, but they offer little insight in why we continue to engage in these practices. Why, for example, we love cars. If we can understand why cars are desirable and buses not, we can perhaps then take the next step, and it's a big one, of not only studying culture, but actively intervening in it. For example, we might help foster a culture where riding a bus or train is seen as more appealing than traveling by car. If we could pull this off, the gains could greatly exceed the impact of what a 100-mile-per-gallon car would have on the climate crisis. This is why I suggested that the humanities have a larger role to play as science and technology in limiting anthropogenic climate change. But make no mistake, this will be no easy task. Developing and manufacturing the next generation of, lithium batteries will certainly be difficult, but no less so than trying to understand why human beings are engaging in perplexing and at times even irrational practices. And car, driving is pretty irrational. As the World Health Organization, WHO, notes, over 50 million people are killed or injured in traffic accidents worldwide. Globally, traffic accidents are the leading cause of death for young people over the age of 10, surpassing malaria, AIDS, and any and everything else. Consequently, the WHO has declared traffic injuries a worldwide epidemic. In addition to being incredibly dangerous, automobiles demand a huge portion of family income, making them far less economical than mass transportation. The average cost of owning, insuring, maintaining, fueling, doing everything else to keep a car in the U.S. is around $9,000 a year. This is a huge financial burden. Indeed, it can work out to the fact that the average American works about 1 day per week just to afford a car. It's often suggested, often by car ads, that they represent freedom to hop in a car at any time and go for a ride. However, imagine the freedom of every week having a 3-day weekend as you didn't need to put in the extra work just to afford a car. Also, people have run the numbers and come up with an interesting figure regarding retirement. If instead of spending $9,000 a year to own a car, you put that money in a retirement account, starting when you first enter the workplace in your 20s, if you did this, you wouldn't have to retire when you were 65, but instead you could retire somewhere in your late 40s. Now that strikes me as real freedom. So how is it that cars, in spite of being incredibly, outrageously dangerous, a huge financial burden, and more disastrous for the environment than any other single source, are cool? Like everything else, this has a history. Here's the short version. The U.S. came out of the Great Depression economically because it was drawn into a highly industrialized war. Industrial output during World War II was staggering, and the U.S. manufacturing alone of things like warships was dramatic. We manufactured 7,000 of them. We made over 300,000 aircraft and around 2.5 million land vehicles in just a few years. When the war came to an end, the challenge was to keep this industrial juggernaut and accordingly the economy going. The automobile played a huge role in this project. The growth of the post-war U.S. automobile industry depended on convincing the public the cars were cool. Getting us to spend huge chunks of our income to buy them and risk our lives driving them was no easy task. Nonetheless, car manufacturers, working hand in hand with politicians and others, pulled it off. In order to ensure that mass transportation did not successfully compete with the car, it received dramatically less federal funding than did industries devoted to the automobile and road infrastructure. Another big part of the solution was to sell the public on the idea of suburbia. Post-war America, if you wanted to get around in the city, get out of the city and into the appealing suburbs, you needed a car. In fact, just getting around in the sprawling suburbs, you needed a car for that. For many families, this meant, to the great delight of the auto industry, that you needed 2 cars, one to get to and from work, one to drive around. At its height in the U.S., a generation ago, 1 in 6 Americans were either directly or indirectly employed by this industry. And this did not include the massive complementary industry of road construction, such as made possible by Eisenhower's Highway Act of 1956, which authorized the creation of 41,000 miles of interstate highways. Although it may sound a little outlandish on first hearing, for decades the backbone of the U.S. economy depended on cars being cool. So cool, in fact, that we knowingly would risk our lives and lavish huge sums of our income on their purchase and upkeep. It's difficult to imagine how a broad swath of the American public would go along with this loose proposition. It's even more difficult to imagine how it continues today in an age when we are aware of the climate change and the environmental consequences. Although it's a little mind-boggling, the carbon footprint of cars in the U.S. exceeds that of our houses and any other single source for that matter. Returning to the big picture, technology alone will not solve the climate crisis. Instead, we need to look hard at rewriting a range of cultural practices, like our love of cars. Even though the challenges that we face are daunting, and let's face it, more than a little scary and depressing, approaching this as a human issue can and should be empowering. There's no need to wait for Elon Musk or anyone else to solve the climate problem, especially as it's clear that these technologies simply cannot do it on their own. Instead, each of us can simply write cars out of our lives. As Americans, we can do even more, as a good deal of the world still looks to us to lay down the precepts of what's cool. Places like Portland, Brooklyn, and a range of other cities in America, an emerging eco-culture is eschewing cars to instead embrace mass transit and bikes as cool, really cool. Conversely, in these places, gas-guzzling SUVs are anything but cool. In terms of the climate crisis, this is sort of exciting, this future-oriented culture, and it may be one of the U.S.'s most important exports in the 21st century with respect to the climate crisis. And yes, even more important, far more important, I would argue, than exporting Teslas. Although it may seem that we will therefore need to do with less, and perhaps even to do without, and I am, of course, suggesting we do without cars, we stand to actually benefit by this bargain. Instead of spending huge chunks of our income on death traps that are wreaking havoc with our climate and planet, we have the opportunity to imagine new and better ways of getting around and new and better ways of spending our time. So, I am curious what you think about the future of cars in the age of the climate crisis and the larger issue of whether you see technological innovations as allowing us to live our lives without change in this new era, or whether you think we are going to have to change certain aspects about the way we live in response to the climate crisis.